getting into attribution, the way to go in this medium is multiple methodologies that overlap, because there is not one tried and true, you can use this methodology of measurement, but you never have to look at a different methodology of measurement. Unfortunately, I'm very sorry to say, that is not the case. I have never heard somebody just be like, oh, you know what? Like, I only use survey-based methodology and period, it's all I use. Or I only use pod sites. That's really all I use. I only use direct. You really want to have multiple methodologies because it allows you to triangulate the story, not the story in like, we're going to tell fanciful stories about the data, but the story of how media is performing and how you can actually translate that against other channels. So what does direct attribution tell us? When we think about direct attribution, it tells us part of the story, right? It's the tip of the iceberg. It is not all, it is an indicator. When you think about last click attribution, which even Google did away with last click attribution as their primary, source of or methodology of attribution, right? It only captures response from about 20%, 20 to 30%, if you're lucky, of users who are being exposed to your ad and converting. And so what this winds up doing is it creates noise in your MMM. It means that you're not optimizing accurately, right? Just because somebody doesn't, for example, follow the path to action from one show doesn't mean that they weren't impacted by that show and ultimately converted based on that. It's the same way that when you look at performance and meta, there's view through attribution on a certain window. The ability to measure in direct attribution is basically us trying to create a parallel to view through attribution for this medium. When you measure just on direct activity, you're probably missing between 70 to 80% of offline activity. And so when we think about survey is one of the ways that I like to tell brands to start. And often, especially post iOS 14.5, with data deprecation, with cookies actually being deprecated sometime next year by Google, I think this methodology is going to become even more omnipresent in marketers' toolkits, essentially. So it's you're probably very familiar with it. It's how'd you hear about us, right? There's a few different ways that you want to make sure that when you're administering a survey for the purpose of media measurement, triangulation, et cetera, what you're trying to do there is eliminate bias. So you want to randomize your choices. You want to keep it short, right? You don't want to have like 27 different choices because you're just going to confuse the heck out of people and they're going to pick something and then move on. It's not going to be helpful to you when it comes to measuring. And then you also want to do baseline removal. Even though you may not have advertised on a podcast, I guarantee you either some host has mentioned you somewhere or some consumer, bless them, is like, I heard about this on a podcast. You're like, no, you didn't. You want to remove baseline because, again, what that gives you is more faith in the methodology and its application to your business. When it comes to how survey-based attribution is calculated, again, you're not throwing out direct attribution, right? You are taking your direct URL or promo attribution. You are adding indirect attribution, and that's how you get a fully attributed picture. And so this is what it looks like. Basically, when you're looking at overall signups from the survey, you are extrapolating the survey responses from podcast. You are then applying that to your known or direct podcast signups. And then you're using that to figure out what your multiplier is, or what your ROAS is. There's a bunch of different ways that you can do this. But the TLDR is that what winds up happening is when you compare and contrast this style of attribution with last click, you see here, again, channels like paid search and paid social are incredible. They are demand capturers. They are not demand generators. Channels like podcast, linear television, terrestrial radio, these are demand generators. So this is where you start to have a more holistic media mix. And when we think about survey-based attribution, this basically just helps us even the playing field between channels that don't have breakage, like paid search, and channels that have a ton of breakage, like podcasts. Because often when you're listening to a podcast, you are not sitting there and being like, oh, I can't wait to write my URL in so that I can follow it. You're probably like cooking dinner or getting ready for the day, or you're on a run and you're not going to like stop what you're doing and pick up your phone. Maybe you have, maybe you're in the middle of baking and you have flour on your hands. So this is why using some sort of indirect methodology really, really helps paint a full picture. It doesn't have to be survey. It can be, so often we will enable a tool like PodSites, ArtsAI, Claritas, et cetera, to enable server-side and pixel-based attribution. There are some challenges with this methodology of attribution, so it's not the sole one that we will rely on, but it is a tool in the toolbox. We also use historical data as baseline to measure lift. Again, this is where when you don't want to use a survey or you can't administer a survey for some reason, let's just say you're an app and there's a dev backlog and you can't get it in yet. There are other ways that you can look at this channel and say, okay, here are some of the ways that I can try and triangulate indirect attribution without creating a lot of dev costs. My personal favorite way to attribute for, I would say, 8 or 9 out of 10 of the companies we work with is a combination of survey, PodSites or other pixel-based server-side attribution. And ideally, if the brand is doing any kind of first-party research or first-party panel, anything like that, that is super, super helpful in addition to these other methodologies to say, what actually made you buy us? What made you finally click the button and sign up or add to cart or whatever? So you can use multipliers from other offline channels, imperfect for obvious reasons, but if you need to in a pinch, you can look at channels like direct mail or even like match market methodology from radio and say, okay, this is what happens when breakage is in the mix. We can probably assume that there will be a similar level of breakage, et cetera, et cetera. Again, that's a leap of faith approach. I like to call myself a reformed brand marketer. So I don't like that approach. I want to look at the data and I want to know how much my media is actually driving for me.
Thanks so much for tuning in. For those of you who aren't familiar with Right Side Up, we're a collective of marketing specialists who have helped more than 600 companies hit their growth goals. We have expertise across all marketing channels, including performance, lifecycle, SEO, social, analytics, creative, and more. Have a growth challenge that needs solving? We'd love to chat. Reach out to us at rightsideup.com.